Hi, and welcome to Ward 13 with John Hopwood. I'm John Hopwood, and we're not going to be talking about Rich Girard tonight. Surprise, surprise, surprise. We are going to be talking about Donald Trump. My guest tonight is Dr. Jeff Kassel. Hello, Dr. Jeff.
Hello, glad to be here.
Now, you haven't talked yourself out on the way here.
No, I haven't. I'm rarely talked out. But I have been following Donald Trump. It's hard to ignore him. No matter what news station you turn on, he's there. He's the top story every single day.
Every day. I used to always follow the news because I used to be a journalist, and I used to start in Sydney, Australia with the Sydney Morning Herald. And then you'd go to the the English language press in India, and then eventually you'd get to Britain, and then you get to New York. But ever since Trump, I just look for Trump first thing, Trump and then news. Mm-hmm. I don't look for just the other subjects
or what he wants.
What's in the headlines. Everything's Trump, Trump, Trump.
He likes being on TV, and he was on TV for years. What was it? What was the network? NBC?
I'm not sure. I guess The Apprentice.
The Apprentice, yeah.
He is a reality TV star.
Yeah.
And now we live in a reality TV show, which is like a bad satiric movie from like the late Jimmy Carter administration. They had a movie called Telethon with John Ritter, where the United States was bankrupt, so they had a telethon. Little do we know that we would become Paddy Chayefsky was the only man to win 3 Oscars for writing. Network was his last one, The Great Satire. But even he couldn't have dreamt up what we're living in now. So
Trump is he's a phenomenon, and
nothing else like it in history.
Well, we've never had a president like Donald Trump, and we've never had a president that claims to hate the press as much as he does and seeks them out every single day.
Oh, there is life's blood.
Yeah, he's addicted to all of these networks, TV. He complains about them endlessly, but he needs them like he needs oxygen.
It's the old saying, there's no, even in Hollywood, there's no such thing as bad press. The bad thing is not to have any press at all.
Well, it's a glib way of putting it, but the international reputation of the United States has crashed.
Oh, that he didn't go to the ASEAN conference? And Pence was there, and they said he did a good job. But the Chinese gained so much traction from that Australia has actually refused to support the United States in the efforts to keep the freedom of the seas open.
I didn't follow that conference
because the Spratly Islands and that.
It might have been better if Trump wasn't there.
Well, that's true, but still, it's funny. Because, I'd like to talk about the psychology later, because you called in Matt Connerton's radio show, and you were talking about psychology. But you also are interested, like, on your Facebook page about economic issues. But when they had the thing about Melania Trump going after John Bolton's number 2, mm-hmm. And then you're saying, there's something about this story which is odd. I was brought up, they call it Sovietology. You have to find the real story. Mm-hmm. What's there, where it is. Then you go to the Department of Defense's own website, which when I was in the Army, they didn't have a website, of course. Well, they did, but, it was we didn't call it anything.
Everybody's got
but
a website.
It wasn't a website where you have, like, your PR or anything. But it was fascinating because Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, former 4-star general, was meeting with a top member of the Politburo from China, one of his top military person, and 2 other important people. And they were talking about trade and how important trade was to the defense and that keeping trade open. This is the Secretary of Defense while his president is, in a supposedly jihad, holy war on China. And all of a sudden this strange story where Melania Trump is going after Bolton's number 2. And Bolton and Mattis do not see eye to eye. Bolton is an old hawk. He wants to take a hard line on everything. Where Mattis, you don't become a four-star general without being a politician and knowing how to, what do you call it, log rolling? You have to be an expert to get to four-star status. And so this is like the real story. And then you're finding about what happened at the ASEAN conference and how Pence stared down Putin and all this. Nothing that's on CNN, nothing that's on MSNBC or Fox. And the Melania story is just a smokescreen, like so much of this stuff. And indeed, after this meeting with Mattis, and there was all the talk about John Kelly, another four-star general, is going to be gone, and he might want to get rid of Mattis. Trump stepped back from his position on Chinese trade, just like he stepped back on many issues like transgendered in the military and that. Because the presidency is a collective. It's not just we don't have a dictator quite yet. And even Hitler used to rail about the courts in Germany, who would do practically anything he wanted. But occasionally, they wouldn't do it as fast or as thorough as he wanted.
Well, what you're saying about Trump and his problems with Kelly, there's been rumors that relationship was in trouble.
Yeah. Right.
But in a way, it's almost like The Apprentice, the drama about who's going to get fired. It's the same thing.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. And so the playbook was written a long time ago when Trump had his TV show. And this drama might be important to Trump, but the rest of us really don't care who's the chief of staff.
But I don't know if that's
who Bolton's number 2 is.
Well, yeah, except for the people that are in the feedback loop and in this echo chamber, because there is this class of talking heads and the people that are addicted to that type of news. That is their life. And they're following, I used with Matt, like with a baby in a crib. You dangle something over its head and it's, where there's real things going on, real issues that aren't being discussed, aren't discussed in the popular press.
Well, you're very right. Now we can discuss Donald Trump from now until the end of time. There's a lot there, but there is something that is happening that's important that nobody's paying any attention to.
The economy.
Yeah, America has run out of money, so we're borrowing trillions.
Well, consumer debt reached $15 trillion, something that was unthinkable until, something happened during the Obama administration, which debt just didn't matter anymore. But $15 trillion of consumer debt.
That happened under Bush. When Cheney was asked about the deficits, Bush number 2.
That's right.
Cheney was asked about the deficits, and he said deficits don't matter.
Yeah, and they tripled the deficit again. Was it doubled?
It doubled during the Obama years, but people blame Obama for that. The truth is no president of the United States has even one vote in Congress. And all the budget bills originate in Congress.
In the House of Representatives.
The presidency, as Trump's finding out, the president doesn't have that much power. His real power is the power of veto.
Yeah.
And I don't think that Donald Trump has exercised that power very often.
He hasn't had to.
Well, he had a majority in both houses.
Right. And you have a split you have the Senate. What do they have, 50? You're going to have 53? No.
Something like that. They're going to have a majority.
The Democrats aren't going to get anything through because you have to have a compromise to get it through the Senate. Even when the House bill.
Even when the Congress was totally Republican, they didn't get much done. And I was actually surprised that nothing got done on immigration.
Yeah, because he's really ham-fisted about that. There are legitimate issues, but the way he goes about it.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I'm not a big Trump fan, but just because Trump says it doesn't make it wrong. And there are some immigration problems. People don't understand what it costs, and the cost is significant, and it's very hard to nail down what the cost is of illegal immigration. What are you doing there, John?
I'm looking up the debt. Reagan went to 1.86. It went from 1
I
trillion.
know these numbers.
Yeah, to 2.86. So he tripled it.
Reagan basically tripled the national debt.
And Bush added 6 trillion.
It was still a pretty small number. It went from about 900 billion total to about just under 3 trillion totals.
And then under Obama, 8.5 trillion, because that's a $1 trillion bailout of the banks. So the whole world economy.
Not just the banks. I mean,
banks and any
GM
financial
got bailed out. They didn't pay back all the money. Chrysler got bailed out. AIG got bailed out. Hartford got bailed out.
The foreign banks
GE got bailed out. But a lot of the bailouts were just temporary because this was seen as a liquidity problem, a cash flow problem, and the money got paid back. And most of the TARP money that went to the banks, that got paid back. I actually know these numbers, so why don't you just ask me?
Well, say what you want to say.
Well, what I'd like to say is the stock market isn't doing that well lately. We had the swoon in October, and the stock market is reacting to something. It is not reacting to earnings, because the earnings for the S&P 500 companies have rocketed up. It's a 20% increase this year. Normally, the stock market reflects better earnings for corporations. But that's not what's happening. The stock market's looking at other things. And I think one of the things it's looking at is debt. And not just national debt, which is around 22 trillion, going to 23 trillion next year. It's looking at corporate debt, which is the greatest it's ever been. And there was a lot of money borrowed
at zero interest rate from the Fed.
Yeah, it's very cheap money, and in fact, the money was free. So who doesn't want free money? So corporations bought back their own stock.
Oh, wow.
With zero cost to them, but eventually all that borrowed money has to be paid back. So that debt goes on their books. So corporations borrowed trillions of dollars and bought back their own stock, and that causes the stock market to go up. But lately the stock market has been dropping.
Corporate debt has risen $2.5 trillion since 2008.
Well, the
Forbes is saying there's a bubble in corporate debt.
And that happened because of zero interest rates. Because when you offer people money for free, and it's not just that it's free, there was some inflation during that period. John, you're making me crazy looking at that screen.
Oh, okay. Why is that?
Because this is a conversation. And when money is at, if you can borrow short term at, say, 0.2%, almost free, and you include the inflation rate, that money is below zero because the inflation rate is near 2%, right, or maybe a little bit more than that. The official inflation numbers, that's a massage number.
But what are they using the debt for?
They're buying back their own stock.
Right, and to drive the share price.
It drives the stock asset class up. So what you had over the last 10 years, as interest rates dropped from 5.5% on the short end, the Fed funds rate, as it dropped from 5.5% down to zero, money became very cheap.
Yeah, it's free.
And
normally, you're saying it's less than free.
It's less than zero. In fact, you're making money.
Think you could be
you're making money borrowing money. So for the corporations to borrow, say, $6 trillion over the last 10 years to buy back their own stock, it's a no-brainer.
So this isn't money being used to create new jobs or create new
well, actually, the opposite
capacity.
The opposite was happening because anything that can be offshored has been offshored.
Hey, I lost my last 2 jobs were offshored. If not the last 2 big ones.
And things are getting mechanized, and there's all kinds of projections out there by think tanks that we're going to lose something like 30 or 40% of the jobs that are available now over the next 20 years because of mechanization and computerization and AI. And
you can go on Brown Ave, the McDonald's. You can punch in your order on a computer, so you don't need an intermediary, and you can do it in any language, many languages. So that will reduce.
There's going to be more of that.
Right.
As they eliminate jobs, and you don't need an order taker at McDonald's.
Do you really think we need a Starbucks on every corner?
I never
Those are
go in
jobs,
there. You know,
huh?
I don't like paying $2 or $2.50 for a
$2?
cup of coffee. What does it
More than
cost there?
that.
What does it cost there?
Well, I guess it's been a long time
I went
since
once,
I've been
10
able to
years
afford.
ago, and it just seemed expensive for a cup of coffee.
You're like Howard Stern. He said he wouldn't buy anything rather than a 75-cent cup of coffee off of a cart in New York. You know, and they have those blue cups that have like a Greek theme on them.
I don't know anything about it.
Oh, you didn't live in New York?
Oh,
you're from New York.
I was born there, but
It's just this
I left
coffee
when
cup. It's
I
like a
was sick.
standard cup. You buy, some god awful coffee off of one of the carts, food carts.
Let me just continue with this theme of debt. Debt grew because the central banks, and not just here in the United States, but central banks all over the world, rates are zero. So if you're only borrowing for a year or so, or 2 years, and a lot of the corporations borrowed short-term debt.
But this went on since 2008,
Right.
2009.
If you look at
far longer than it was supposed to.
That's right. And normally, when you create trillions of dollars, and the central banks did that, it causes inflation.
Yeah.
But they didn't see that much inflation in the general economy, because all the inflation, all that borrowed money, all those bonds that the Fed bought with newly created money, and it was trillions of dollars of bonds, the inflation went into the bond market, and it went into the stock market, and to some extent it went into the real estate market. Anything bought with borrowed money went up in value.
Oh, so that
It never left the canyons of Wall Street, the money.
So that's the gambit to put the inflation into those assets.
Well, think about it. You know, what would happen? What happens if the stock market craters like it did in 2000? The stock market started dropping in around November of 2007 to March of 2009. So it's almost 18 months.
Well, those things can't happen, Dr. Jeff.
Well, they did happen, you know, and
we live in a what is
don't we
live in the post-historic world, post-history? Although that paradigm of post-Reagan thinking went up in 2008. That we're free of the cycles of history, we're free of the cycles of the economy.
Well, we're not free of economic cycles.
Isn't this been the longest bull market in history?
Yeah, and it looks like it looks like it might end. You know, I think there's like a 50% chance that we're going to be looking at something very much like 2007 to 2009.
But Dr. Jeff, everything defies everything that I was brought up to believe when I went to university and studied economics. Well, I didn't focus on that, but I took courses.
Political science you studied, right?
And you studied.
But political science is about the money.
Right. So you study that, and everything just defies the logic of what I was brought up in. That what goes up has to come down.
There's a kind of an economic gravity, but when you start inflating asset classes like stocks or bonds or real estate, the way you do it is by making a lot of cheap money available. And for example, when I bought my house in 1977 here in Manchester, the interest rate that I paid for that loan was 8.45%.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interest rates used to be about 6 when I was a kid, because I graduated from high school that year. But it had been,
Yeah.
Things started going higher.
This was 40 years ago when I bought my house. So the interest rates have been declining, and a few years ago, you could borrow money to buy an expensive house in Bedford, and you could borrow that money for about 3.5%.
I think it got even less than that.
It might have gone, if it's a 15-year loan, maybe less. And so when interest rates start going up, that affects the asset class and the real estate market, because if you bought your house for $450,000 and you're paying 3.3% interest, if that interest rate goes to 6% or 7%, or like it was for me in 1977, 8.5%, the price of that real estate has to come down. And the reason it comes down is because people look at the monthly payment, what they can afford each month.
That was what they used to do.
Yeah, well, people look at the monthly payment, and so the price of the house, as interest rates rise, the price of the house has to fall.
But Dr. Jeff, it used to be, I had a cousin that was in banking, and she said when you made mortgages, not only do you have to justify them to federal bank regulators, but you had to do it to the state too. And then sometime during the W administration. That all just disappeared, that type of regulation. And it used to be you could only afford 2.5 to 3 times your income. That certainly disappeared. And this, I was also brought up to believe that a nation that moves from positive savings into debt with no savings, that was a destabilizing thing. And the amount of consumer debt that people have, that would be
How much did you say it was?
$15 trillion,
15
a
trillion.
record.
Now,
It
does
would be
that include the
unthinkable.
1.5 trillion in student debt?
Oh, yeah, I guess so, yeah, all debt.
The total amount of debt in the United States, total debt,
Of course, our GDP allegedly is $19 trillion.
yeah,
but-
something around there.
Right, which
Yeah.
is,
So the federal debt, the U.S. government debt, is around 20, almost 22 trillion.
right.
Now, on top of that is student debt,
What is the
mortgage
debt-
debt, consumer debt, auto loan debt, state debt, city debt.
Oh, yeah, we're not even adding those in, the disasters.
It's something in the area of about $70 trillion.
Jeez.
And this is it's a number that most people can't even wrap their head around.
Well, 10 years ago, there was over $600 trillion in derivatives. So, and there weren't enough assets in the entire world.
I don't even know what that means.
Yeah,
because
what does it mean?
the derivatives are usually these are.
I remember swaps and options,
Yeah.
but then they became all these exotic derivatives to the point you can't even follow what's going on.
Well, the credit default swaps was the reason AIG and some of the big banks that had trading divisions, those swaps were really insurance on mortgage debt.
Right.
And nobody was actually watching these collateralized mortgages in 2007 and 2008. But the big investment houses like Lehman and Bear Stearns,
which no longer
Goldman
exist.
Sachs, they were buying and selling this stuff
Right.
to each other,
And making great profits.
and that margin and that whole market crashed. And the credit default swaps were the insurance on that mortgage debt.
Right.
So AIG was expected to make good on those crashed mortgage securities, and they couldn't do it because they didn't have the money.
Right.
So the federal government ended up bailing out that insurance company, and because if they didn't do that, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Lehman, Bear Stearns, they would have all collapsed, and two of them did collapse.
Right.
And so when a bank collapses, people have to understand. All you have to. Most people don't do this, but I look at numbers all day, and I look at credit. The United States and every other country runs on credit.
Of course.
It runs on borrowed money.
Alexander Hamilton wanted a national debt and got one, and the Jeffersonians were always against that.
Well, it allows.
He wanted to run a national debt.
Try to
We
think,
can go into the
try
reasons
to
for
think
that.
of it this way. During 1929, we had a market crash, and one of the reasons we had a market crash is there was a lot of borrowed money in the stock market, and you could borrow up to 90% of the value of the
Right.
stock.
You bought on margin.
They made that illegal. They call it buying on margin. And if the market falls, let's say you're margined out. 90% of your stock holdings was bought with debt. Okay. If the market drops 20%, you got to make up that 10% shortfall. So you got to sell stock to do it.
Right.
Yeah. So the big investment guys, the hedge funds, the investment houses, they sold stock to meet the margin call so they could have enough cash in their account. But when they sold their stock, that caused cascading sales other places. So the stock market drops when they're selling because they own tremendous amounts of stock. And as that cascading selling went on, it finally caused Lehman to go bankrupt, and Bear Stearns, both of them.
Yeah.
They had a liquidity problem. So they tried to rescue these banks, but because the country runs on debt, small businesses need debt. You need to borrow money if you're going to buy a house.
Well, that was one of the complaints about the bailout, TARP and all that, that the capital that would actually help your average person going to mid or small businesses, it was all hoovered up, to use an English phrase from England, and was redistributed to the big banks.
The banks were recapitalized by the taxpayer.
Right. The taxpayer.
And to be fair, the taxpayer supposedly got all that money back. But because we're running these horrendous deficits, these shortfalls. For example, this year,
How did we get it all back?
well, they
Because
paid the banks.
so we
paid
went
the-
into debt.
the banks
and
paid
then we
them-
get.
the banks paid the TARP money back.
Did they?
They did. They paid all the money they borrowed back with interest. And
With money they borrowed for less than zero, right?
I
So
think
you could
they
buy.
probably
You
did
could borrow the money to pay your debts. I would like to be have this deal, wouldn't you?
Well, a lot of people thought it was a very unfair deal because you and I can't get that kind of deal.
And only one banker in the whole debacle went to jail. And I think that person was a very minor slip up. There were no prosecutions or anything.
There were attempts at prosecutions, but they failed.
Wow, they
and-
weren't pursued like Kamala Harris, when she was the Attorney General, let the Wells Fargo off with a slap. You know, this was basically fraud. When you're saying, I've heard all the stories. I remember driving up in New Jersey, hearing some poor dear that had been a mortgage banker, you know, dealing with the flim-flammery. And, you know, he was a victim too, you know, because all that money he was making, he was doing cocaine, cheating on his wife.
Now, who's this?
Some guy, some talking head on one of those National Public Radio, biting journalism from National Public Radio. I wished I could have recorded it because the guy was just, I'm a victim of the bubble breaking. The bubble I created.
Well,
everybody
you can
denies that
find
it was
this.
any fraud.
You can go at public radio does actually record this stuff, so you can actually access it.
Should write it as a screenplay, but people live beyond belief nowadays. It's all blue skies now. It's all a hustle. Everybody's bought the sizzle, not the steak. But think about consumer debt, what it does to create what would you call it, a consent. We basically, when I got out of the Army in 1989, I bought a Sony VCR. It cost $300. Geez, you can buy, for that, and a little extra, you can go buy a UHD TV curved. I go in and look at the prices of these consumer goods made by slave labor in China, and it's just incredible, the prices. And why do you need a new TV of this caliber every year or so? But people do. The consumption of consumer goods, these cheap consumer goods, by your average American.
Well,
I think we all know that food is subsidized, and it has been since at least the Depression, in order to keep wages. It keeps a brake on wages. If you support the food industry, so that the prices are lower, you can keep a brake on wages because they don't have to go higher.
Well,
But
the
this
whole idea
culture we live in.
of this so-called free trade movement that started even before Clinton. I think Clinton signed off on the NAFTA
Free
deal.
trade goes back to the British,
Yeah.
19th century.
But
Democrats were until Clinton were against free trade because they saw it as a threat against labor.
yeah, well, this is before the Democrats turned on their constituency.
And yes,
Yeah,
the
and
working
that's
class,
exactly what happened.
who are now with Trump.
Democrats are supposedly for the working man, and Trump also claimed he was for the working man. And
Well, he actually talked to the working man, unlike the Democrats. The working man.
Once we
man.
went to a free trade system where there weren't going to be tariffs for the most part.
Right.
Now China does violate that.
Constantly, and their currency is, they manipulate their currency.
So we manipulate ours.
Yeah.
This is kind of normal. But when the jobs went to China, when millions and millions of jobs went to China, there was an unholy alliance between the Democrats, the Republicans, and corporate America. And the people that got screwed by that were the American worker. Well, Trump tried to leverage that when he was running for president.
Because
And
nobody
he said, "I'm going to bring the jobs back." But
which we all know is impossible.
well, most people believe
gone.
A lot of people believed it. But you're right. Once the jobs go, they're not coming back here where labor is at $18 an hour.
You're never going to be able to make a television set as cheaply as you can in China and then sell it even at that price, this rock bottom price, and still make profits.
Well, the thing that was so interesting, China was not allowed into the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, the so-called free trade system, for a long time.
For many, 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 many years.
And then under Clinton or Bush, they were allowed in provisionally. Clinton. It had to be approved every year, but this wasn't to benefit China. This was actually to benefit corporate America.
Right.
Who was able to get rid of the American workers and then hire coolie labor out of China,
right.
or India, or Pakistan, or any of these countries where the labor rate is $2 an hour instead of $18.
Yeah,
and so America got screwed.
$2 an hour, $2
as both
a day.
Democrats and Republicans became the proxies and the whores of corporate America.
I would say that the Democrats have become the Rockefeller Republican Party, but that's an insult to Rockefeller Republicans. They basically have adopted the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman, trickle-down economics, which was first used in Brazil after the junta that came with the coup of '64.
I really, that's
1964.
That's before my day.
You can see it working out in California. In Brazil, which is half black, the paradigm, which is worked up by Milton Friedman, is that you immiserate the bottom half of the people, and the money, whatever capital is down there, percolates up to the small group of people, which were white in Brazil, that as at the apex of the pyramid. And then there's a small mestizo class below them, that some of the money would trickle down to them as middlemen or dealing. But very little would get to the bottom part of the triangle.
I've never been. Have you been in Brazil?
No, but they were kept in place by brute force. Remember, in the 70s, the police gangs that would just go murder people, street criminals and that. Yeah. And
the disappeared.
In California, I've seen it. I actually experienced it. The disappearing middle class there. Now it's you're either going to be rich. San Francisco had working class white people, working class bars and that. When I was there,
it's been an expensive city for a long time.
It has been, but there were working class districts and places, and you'd have to. Because there were good jobs and good wages, but you could still live in the city. But now it's just this group of people, these nerds, that have to be, in their buses, have to be taken in and out, There used to be... You're
talking about the high-tech workers?
Yeah, the high-tech workers who have no relationship with what I would deem a reality that I came up through, or most people do.
Okay, well, I mean...
They had the grandfather in, the white middle class. Remember Proposition 13?
Long time ago, 30, 40 years ago.
And property taxes were brutal in California before Prop 13. But when I was there, they passed an initiative that you could pass on your house to your kid. Because otherwise, the kid was going to have to leave and go to white flight in California was going to Nevada or Idaho. It used to be going to Washington and Oregon, but they became expensive too, as Silicon Valley migrated first to Seattle and then down to Oregon.
It's everywhere now, though.
But it's just, and then I saw in a short period, California just transformed into this new world, where the old middle class, you could go to Berkeley for $1,000 a year. You can't do that anymore. Everything has to be paid for. States have to pay for things. They can't run debt the federal government.
This takes us back to debt. And let's assume, I don't know the exact number, but let's assume...
check the time.
Let's assume that it's $70 trillion in the United States. We're the most indebted country in the world in terms of the federal debt. But generally, we've got more debt in the United States probably than any other country. And... the thing about debt is you've got to liquidate debt somehow. Either you pay it off, you roll it over, or you bankrupt out of it. And what happened in 1929 to about 1932 is we bankrupted out of a lot of that debt. Deflation. Yeah, we bankrupted out. We couldn't pay it back. The debt was excessive. In 1929, 1930, 1931, the debt to GDP ratio is about 270%. In other words, the total debt in the United States was 270% of GDP. So it was much bigger than GDP. Now it's almost 400% of GDP. So there was a debt bubble during the beginning of the 1930s, and now we have an even bigger debt bubble. But when you have growing debt like that, and you know you have to service it or pay it back or somehow deal with it, you have to worry about what the interest costs. You know what we paid in interest last year on the federal debt? It was the fourth or fifth largest item in the budget. It was over $500 billion.
Which
half
used
$1 trillion
to be,
of interest.
Which used to be a unconscionable deficit for a year.
That's right.
billion.
Not too long ago either.
Right.
$500 billion every year, but over the next 4 or 5 years, that interest cost is going to nearly $1 trillion a year. So this has now gotten out of hand. And I think the stock market is starting to watch it, because as the Fed started to increase short-term rates, it became a problem for the people holding debt. And if, let's say you borrowed on the short end, 1 year borrowing, your cost of interest was maybe 12 or 0.12 or 0.2% for the money when you borrowed it. And only certain corporations that have good credit ratings can borrow at that level. But now the short rate is 2.25%. It's gone up 800%.
So you have to roll over your debt at the higher
That's
rate?
right. And this is true for the federal government. They have to roll over the debt that's expiring, because the bonds come due, in which case the bondholders have to be paid the principal in addition to the interest that they're owed. About 4 or 5 trillion of that has to be rolled over every year, and of the 22 trillion that we've got. And this is going on at the state level and the city level, and so the interest costs are going to rocket up. And this is a big problem for people that have to finance large amounts of debt.
Yeah, but what does it mean to just the average person?
Well, if you get a pension, as I do, I'm an old guy, I get a pension, and you begin to wonder whether that's going to continue.
Well, do you have a federal pension?
I have a federal pension, so the federal government's got to pay my pension.
What about municipal pensions and like the police have and that? Because in places like Chicago, it seems like they're having horrific problems.
Well, Chicago's going to go bankrupt.
Yeah.
Chicago's going to go bankrupt. Cook County, about 2 or 3 years ago, raised the sales tax. It was 10.5%.
How can it be 10.5%?
Well, the sales,
California got up to 9.
the rooms and meals tax in Manchester is what, 9%?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, 9%. So, I mean, they may say cost of living increases are not, there's no inflation out there, but there is a lot of inflation, and taxes are going up, and the things they tax are going up.
Hedonics, your living is better. A beautiful TV costs so much cheaper, which is true. That was a invention of the Clinton era, hedonics. That there's a quality of these products that can't quite be placed in old-fashioned economic theory. But in that way, they could massage things to understate the inflation rate. Because it used to be you'd have the GNP versus the GDP.
They do want to understate the inflation.
And they do, because
because this year, for example, I get, Social Security recipients are going to get like 2.2% or 2.3%.
Some years you didn't get any.
Well, some years they claimed we had no inflation, but it's nonsense. You can't believe what the government
says.
Yeah,
because
they lie.
It's a basket, and they keep out the volatile food and energy sector. So how can you have an accurate figure on inflation if you're keeping two of the things that drive inflation out of the basket? We have hedonics.
There's a massive amount of money transfer going on in the United States.
You mean between the generations?
No, I'm talking about the transfer of the federal government to pension recipients.
I was thinking about when
it's over $1 trillion a year for Social Security.
In the 1990s, when they realized that the GI generation and the silent generation were going to pass on trillions to the baby boomers, they started changing things about Medicare and everything. At first it's 3 years and then 6 years.
I'm sorry, what
about
does that
owning
mean?
some. Well, it used to be, if you had a house and you were on Medicare,
Medicaid.
You were in Medicare, and you went to a nursing home, Medicare would pay it. They wouldn't take any money out of your estate. Then it came up, well, unless you give the house to the kids and you live another 3 years.
I don't know what those rules are anymore, but
Well,
you're
they're
right.
up to 6 now. But when they realized that there was going to be this huge transfer of money between the generations, the feds decided, Congress decided, well, we need a share of that. And they went after it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like my sister just went on Medicare, and a friend, and then you realize you have to pay $300 to be on Medicare?
I'm sorry, what?
Medicare.
You have to pay $300?
Now you do. If, my generation,
There were
baby
two,
boomers.
There are two parts to Medicare, two main parts. One Part A,
B,
pays
C,
the
and-
hospital bills up to
Right.
80%, and that's free if you're eligible for
80%,
Medicare.
thank you.
80%.
A hospital bill could be
Part
$1 million
B
bucks.
is the doctor's bills, and it pays 80% of the doctor's bills. And
There's D is
they are means
pharmaceuticals.
testing Part B now. If you're a single person and you have over $80,000 of income,
We want your money.
you pay more for Part B than someone that has $20,000 of income. So they means test it, and there are staggered rates. But I guess the point I'm making is, we're seeing the stock market very unhappy with. You would think that when corporations got a 40% tax cut, which is what they got from the Republican Congress, they got a 40% tax cut.
What happened to that middle class tax cut that Trump was trumpeting about that he gave us during his rallies?
Some
for the
people
election?
got it, but it wasn't much.
They didn't get it. Most people didn't get anything.
I will tell you that Donald Trump got quite a tax cut. And,
Well, it's in his
and
blood.
the richer you are,
It's in his
the
blood.
more money you got back.
Incidentally, all the tricks that his father played for him to pass on $300 million, the Kennedys, the Rockefellers, everybody does the exact same thing.
I don't know. I think there was actually some fraud when it came to the movement of assets from the father
No,
to the kids.
there's no fraud until they prove it in a court of law. And nothing happened.
Well,
Listen, one of the memes that always is so much fun from like Bernie Sanders supporters and liberal Democrats is, we should go back to having a 90% income tax or 70% and we'll sock it to the rich. Remember when Nelson Rockefeller was appearing before the Senate for his confirmation hearings? He was one of the few billionaires in the world then, and he paid zero income tax.
I didn't know that.
He paid zero because, he and all the other Rockefellers were very generous and had many tax write-offs.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't pay him. He didn't pay taxes.
Well, these days, if you're a rich person, and let's say you're in the top tax bracket, I don't know what the new top tax bracket is at the federal level, but it was around 39%.
Yeah, that's what it was.
And if you're paying, and you live in California, and you're paying a California state income tax,
Which can go up to 10%.
okay, let's say it's another 10%, so that's 39 plus 10,
Yeah,
it's
Washington.
49.
In Washington D.C., if you're a person of means, you're going to have half your income is going to be taken
Okay,
out.
it's half your
Yeah.
income in California too,
Yeah.
according to you. But that doesn't include sales tax and real estate tax, and we are actually pretty taxed.
We're taxed here in New Hampshire up the wazoo.
Well, we don't have an income tax here. We have a business profits tax and a business enterprise tax. So if you're a carpenter and you work for yourself, you'll pay that if you hit the threshold. But a lot of them don't hit the threshold.
Make sure you don't.
Yeah, well,
Take it under the table.
everybody's trying to avoid taxes, and they want to pay as little as they can.
That's as American as apple pie.
It didn't used to
Nobody
be.
wanted to pay. None of the British colonies wanted to pay any taxes.
It didn't used to be.
Oh,
when,
come on.
when this country started, we didn't have an income tax.
Not till 1913. Well, they had one in the Civil War, but then the Supreme Court struck it down. Then you had, what was it, is the 16th Amendment? Yeah. But that was only supposed to be for unearned income. That was supposed to just hit the coupon cutters. But they raised more money with the income tax.
It was a small tax then.
From 1917 to 1920. In those 3 years, they raised more money to the income tax by finagling it. Woodrow Wilson. More money than had been taken in by the entire United States government in the previous 100-some-odd years to pay for World War I. And then, when World War II rolled around, the income tax expanded to almost everybody. Anybody that made money. Even common laborers were going to have to pay income tax. It wasn't supposed to.
By the way,
Yeah.
we forgot the Social Security and Medicare tax for the rich people. in California. So on the income tax,
Oh, but
federal and state income tax in California,
it's
you said it's
capped.
49%,
capped.
plus sales tax, plus Medicare tax, plus Social Security tax. You're talking about a lot of money. I mean, they're 65% tax rate. That's a lot of money. And should the federal government and the state governments be taking all this money from you? I mean, do we really have an efficient government? Do I really want to support a federal government that's perpetually at war in 10 different countries? I mean, what are we doing?
Well, war is not subject to GATT, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. So all your defense industries, you can subsidize them where you can't, subsidize other industries because it's against GATT. So, that type of arrangement means we have to be at war and we have to have a permanent war economy in order to protect certain industries that lobby very heavily and spread a lot of money around.
Well, we sell a lot of weapons.
Oh, yeah, that's Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
That they went through. They cut up the Washington Post reporter who was technically under the protection of the United States as a refugee.
Well, was he a political?
Oh, yeah. He had sanctuary here in the United States.
Amnesty? Was he given amnesty to come in?
Yeah, some type of refugee status. So he was not
He was
an
a permanent
American
resident.
citizen, but he was supposedly under our flag for that. That's why I guess he thought he could step into the Saudi embassy, which seems very foolhardy in
How much time do we
retrospect.
have, John?
About 10 minutes.
Okay, let's go to Donald Trump because
Okay, we can talk about more about this because the economy is just stupefying, and I
well,
think
it's very hard to get.
Well, it doesn't make any
to wrap your
sense
head around the
anymore.
numbers because they're huge.
Makes no
But
sense
but
anymore.
one of the reasons that Donald Trump was interesting to some people, some Republicans, is because he promised to eliminate the deficit in 1 year, and he promised to eliminate the national debt in 8 years. But like many things that Donald Trump said, it was a complete lie. And under Trump, the deficits expanded. Last year, we had about an $800 billion.
Oh, we're going to get that Trump background?
We had about an $800 trillion.
Is it black too? throw Manchester on that or something.
Yeah, I want to put it on.
Yeah, so
And next year, the deficit will be $1 trillion, and it's going higher.
1.1. Yeah, I think it's going to be 1.1 trillion.
Well, it's going to be higher. And
It's just
this
debt.
assumes
He's the debt president.
Yeah.
He made a living off of debt, Dr. Jeff.
Yeah, well,
7 bankruptcies.
That's the problem.
Maybe he can take
when you
us
can't
through
pay the
one.
debt back. When you can't pay the debt back, you go bankrupt. And he had a number of corporate bankruptcies, and he has been in a lot of financial trouble, and he's pretty much lied his way through the whole thing. One of the things I don't understand about these Trump supporters, and there's a lot of them, he's at 42%.
No, he's
Approval.
up. He's up in the Gallup poll because of his handling of the economy.
Yeah.
He's at an all-time record. I think it's 45 or a little, maybe even higher.
There's an average of the polls, and it's about 42% approval.
A poll of polls, like a fund of funds, like Bernie Kornfeld.
Kind of, it's an average of all the polls. He's at, let's say it's 40%. But what I don't understand is if you told John,
Yep.
look at me.
I am. Pretend that my eyes. I got to get one of those hats.
He's
with
looking
two
at his
eyes on
phone.
it. I'm going to find out what he is in the Gallup poll.
Yeah.
I'm listening.
Okay.
I was in the Army. I learned how to listen while.
What I don't understand is why someone who tells 5 lies a day is ever going to be taken seriously by anybody.
Oh, come on. Why can't you get anything good? I have a lot of problems with Google, but that's a whole show in itself.
We shouldn't be doing
Well, I
this
have
on a
it
live
Fox.
TV show.
Geez, if they had the roof crashing down and stuff, you just go on, you soldier on. It makes it much more interesting, don't you think?
No.
Oh, I always love when there were screw-ups and stuff.
No, I don't think it makes it more interesting.
I do.
But you tell me, why does anybody believe Donald Trump?
53% of respondents approve of how the president's handled the economy, up from 50. This guy's going to get reelected in 2020. Mark my words.
Mm-hmm.
He's more popular than Ronald Reagan amongst Republicans.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan probably couldn't get elected now. Republicans wouldn't vote for
No,
him.
people won't.
He would be
that
considered.
Brill cream look.
He'd be considered a
Communist.
snowflake.
Well, and then the Brill cream.
Yeah, but
It's just so out there.
But Normally when people tell 5 lies a day, nobody takes them seriously.
Five lies a day? Geez, he can tell 80 lies in just a 1 hour rally.
Well, actually, I watched him today. He
defended his daughter.
As soon as he talks to the press, all the TV news stations, put him on the air.
He's big ratings.
And he told some serious lies today about Saudi Arabia buying hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons from the United States. I think
they're buying trillions, aren't they?
Well, according to it depends on what day you catch Trump. But the truth is there's only been about $12 billion of sales. This is a significant number. But when a U.S. permanent resident gets hacked to pieces in an embassy in Turkey,
they have the tape,
and it's recorded.
There's something screwy with that too.
Well, you do kind of wonder why he went into that.
This is
embassy.
what I think. I have hundreds of books on history and intelligence, military intelligence, spycraft and everything. I can't believe that the Saudis would have followed through with that. And Mohammed had met with him not too long ago. When Mohammed was here a few months ago, that the president didn't give him the thumbs up to do that. I can't believe that the Saudis would act that brazenly without him knowing.
They execute people. They chop people's heads off publicly in that country.
Yes, but you're dealing with a person that is under protection in the United States, and that's a journalist for the Washington Post, which is the least favorite newspaper next to the failing New York Times.
Yeah, the failing New York Times, right.
I mean, this stuff we only have 5 minutes. This stuff, it's just, and then they have a recording. I mean, none of it makes sense unless it's, yes, we have a dictator, a wannabe dictator, and it's open season on murdering journalists, just like it is in the former Soviet Union.
What do you think that Donald Trump's
endgame is?
What do you think his purpose as president is? Is it
Donald Trump?
He wants to enrich himself. He wants to monetize the presidency.
That's why he ran.
Okay.
Well, his ego is not.
Let's assume that's true.
We talked about him. You can come back. Being because I asked you, is there really such a thing as a narcissistic personality disorder? And you said there was. And then you said Trump would be, like an emblematic of such a
Trump
disease.
is a narcissist.
Because there's egotism, but egotism is not the same thing.
It's very similar. It's basically the idea that other people and other things just orbit around you. It's a self-centeredness.
Oh, I've seen that.
And it's a self-absorption. And this is why Trump wants to be on TV every day, because he wants everybody paying attention to him. And the fastest way to get attention is to say something outrageous. So he makes sure he says something outrageous every day.
Is he really, because I always had the idea that he had this act going, but he wasn't a stupid man.
Why do you say that?
From impressions I've got over the years. I've known about him since the early 80s when I was living in New York City.
I went to college with him.
Yeah,
But back then, the undergraduate Wharton School really wasn't that special. Anybody could get in. And he was in a very special program at the Wharton School.
Because he started out at
Fordham. To a large extent financed by his father.
Oh, because he started out at Fordham.
Yeah, he had 2 years at Fordham, and he transferred into the Wharton College. And he was in a real estate program. And
oh, really?
Yeah. And it was actually a very small program. A dozen students or so were in it, and it really wasn't much. But I am not too impressed with Donald Trump's logic, his ability to...
I am. He's bamboozled the entire country.
Not the entire country. 45% of the people think he's...
Hey, that's enough for the Electoral College, What did he have, 44%?
It was a fluke. Donald Trump...
Fluke?
Donald Trump was an accident. He was a political accident.
He is America. If you look at even Thomas Mann, the Nobel Prize-winning German author, wrote a book about con men. With Europeans, the American con man, whether he's like Elmer Gantry or just some type of hustler, to them, that's America. Because there's a certain freedom and bravado about some huckster going out there. Because you really can't get away with that in Europe. And he is the embodiment of America, I think, and the spirit of America. New Hampshire gave this great land Donald Trump, because he won 60% of the vote.
He didn't.
Yes, he did in the New Hampshire primary.
In the New Hampshire primary.
Oh,
he
yeah,
won
and
60%.
he was just like catapulted like a flatus out of an elephant's behind.
He lost New Hampshire
You
in
know
the
what
general.
a flatus is? You're an educated person. A fart. He just ejaculated out of the behind of
He did not
the New
win
Hampshire GOP.
He did not win New Hampshire in the general election.
He came damn close
He
because
came
I was
close.
out there and I almost got lynched.
He came pretty
Like
close.
a Carol J. Porter sign out, and somebody's going to lynch me because they thought it was a Hillary sign.
You see, that was the problem. That's why Trump won.
You get the last 30 seconds or so.
Trump won because he was running against the worst Democrat candidate in the history
In the history of the
history
world.
of the party.
The history of the multiverse, you know,
Yeah.
the billion.
Yeah. That's why he won.
Multiverses.
And now the rest of us have to deal with this as the country's going bankrupt.
What would Matt Connarton and I have to talk about if it wasn't for Trump? Our semi-partnership would have ground a long time
Well,
ago.
you could talk about the national debt, but that's not interesting to most people.
It isn't. We should have we should do a radio show from that and talk about stuff like this. We might get about 3 viewers. Other than my 13 viewers of Ward 13. We'll see you next week, and we'll have you back soon, Dr. Jeff.
Okay.
Yes.